My name is Helper Wesley, and in this video, hey there, my name is Helper Wesley, and in this video, we'll be talking about events that relate to the Physics 2.0 behavior. This video builds off of the Physics 2.0 in-depth behavior video that went over all of the variables inside of the behavior sheet. You might be able to tell what I'm going to make by the end of this video based on the scene here. But let's start by going into the event sheet. To begin with, if I add a condition and search for Physics Engine 2.0, I'll be given a bunch of conditions that I can use to create events for this behavior. And then if I go to Actions and click on an object with the Physics 2.0 behavior, I'll be shown a list of actions that apply to that behavior. We can change the body settings, its velocity, its forces and impulses, in which a force is meant to be applied over time, and an impulse is meant to be applied immediately. So if you were going to use this to make a driving game, for example, you can use a force to speed up as you hold the acceleration button. But then if you were going to make a platformer, for example, you would use an impulse to jump. And you can also change layers and masks from in here as well. So I've really quickly created this to show you how these controls might be applied to a thing. Note that this is really simplistic. If you wanted to use this to create an actual character, you would add in maximum speeds for conditions and other things like that. But what we have here are some forces, not impulses, that will be applied over time while we're holding these keys. And then for rotation, we use a torque, which is a force that applies to rotation. And then to put the brakes on, we change its angular and linear dampening while we're holding the space key. So if I preview the game, I can move the object around by pressing these keys. And you can see how this object, which has a dynamic body, is able to move and collide with the static body of the scene around it. And now if you're curious to know how GDevelop determines the scale and gravity applied to objects, after you've given the Physics 2.0 behavior to an object, you can right-click on your scene, open your scene properties, and you'll see gravity and scale. Gravity is pretty self-explanatory, 9.81 being the default gravity, but the scale is by pixels. And for the most part, you'll leave this alone unless your game is really tiny or really big. By default, it's 100, which means that every 100 pixels is equal to 1 meter. If your scale is set wrong, you can get some weird results from the behavior. But now let's talk about joints. If we go to the event sheet, click to add an action, and search Physics Engine 2.0, we'll be shown a bunch of different joint actions. Joints basically pin two objects together, either at a distance or literally one over the other, and apply different logic based on which kind of joint it is. There's an example game that I linked down below that does a great job of showing you what each one does. But in this video, we're going to be using the revolute joint. Revolute joint comes in two forms. Add revolute joint between two bodies, which pins two objects together, or just add revolute joint, which will pin it to the position in scene. So to do this properly, we're going to go to the object, open it up, and go to Edit Points. We're going to add a point on the object that we want to pin it at, and add the same point to the other object as well. And then we'll put both of those in scene. We'll add the condition at the beginning of scene, and then the action, add a revolute joint to the moving part at the X and Y position of the points we just put in. And then do that for the second object as well. Then we'll create another event with a condition, if the spacebar is pressed, apply an angular impulse, which is just an impulse that applies to a rotation, of -60 to the first object, and then do the same thing to the second object, but with +60. And we'll make sure to disable the other controls. If I open up this revolute joint action, I can show you more specifically what we're doing. So the X and Y anchor are the X and Y points I made earlier. We've set angle limits to be on, so it can only rotate between the angle of 30 and 90, using the opposite for the other object. And then we have motor turned off because we don't want it to move on its own. If you turn the motor on and give it some variables, it's going to rotate around that point at that speed. But we don't want to do that right now because we're using an angular impulse to rotate the paddle. And now if we preview the game, this isn't actually going to work right. Both objects have the same layers and masks. So to fix this, we need to change the paddles to be on layer and mask 2 instead of 1. And this way they won't detect collision with each other anymore. And now they'll be able to move. So I can put the ball back into the scene, this time with a higher density than last time, so it acts more like a pinball than a bouncy ball. And I'll put some objects up there for it to bang into. And now when I preview the game, I can play something kind of like pinball. Note that the ball is on layer and mask 1 and 2, so it collides with both the paddles and the walls. One more example I suggest you go check out. It's a little silly, but it uses revolute joints with different maximum and minimum angles to create this effect. And don't forget to check out the joints example, so you'll be able to better understand how those work. Some of these joints can be really cool. This has been a tutorial covering some of the conditions and actions related to the Physics 2.0 behavior. Be sure to comment down below and tell us what kind of tutorial you want to see next. Maybe we'll add it to the pile. I have been Helper Wesley, and I'm glad I could help.
Hey, Max here. In this video, we'll be covering bitmap text and tile maps. Before anything else, I should point out that at the time of this video being uploaded, the objects that are covered in this video are considered experimental. This is just because there's still additional testing and features that would like to be added to these objects later down the road. In the meantime, you can still access them by clicking the Show Experimental Objects button at the bottom of the Objects window. And of course, if you run into any issues with these objects, definitely let us know your feedback. Let's first take a look at bitmap text. For all intents and purposes, you can basically think of bitmap text as a normal text that requires a special bitmap text font file. If you're not already familiar with the text object, definitely check out our video on that. Anyway, these bitmap text font files have to be generated with a special software, and you can check out the link in the description for a list of some suggestions. This allows you to do to the text whatever you can in an image editor. And for this reason, one of the main use cases for bitmap text is full stylization. Bitmap text is also significantly more performant than standard text, so they are a good choice if you are very concerned about performance. Finally, the bitmap text format gives you full control over the resolution of your font. So if you need to scale into your text, then this is the option for you. As for the object properties, most of them are pretty straightforward and just the same as with the normal text object. Just make sure to select your FNT file as well as your actual Atlas PNG file. If you forget one, it will not render. One last thing to keep in mind, it's a good idea to include some padding when you actually export your font file, as this can potentially help reduce unwanted rendering artifacts later down the line. Next, we'll take a look at the tile map object. This allows you to import tile maps you've made using a software called Tiled. So I'm not going to get super in depth on how to use Tiled since it's really its own thing, but you can still check out the description for some excellent resources on learning Tiled. Anyways, conceptually, the idea here is that you have now a single image, which is your tile map, and you'll build all of your interactable objects and enemies on top of that. There is an excellent guide on the wiki for how to use GDevelop with Tiled, but if you hate reading, like I do, then here are the most important things to keep in mind. First of all, GDevelop only supports orthogonal map types. It also does not support Z standard compression at this time, so keep that in mind. And when you go to make your tile set, you need to either embed it in your current map, or if you don't, you're going to need to manually include it in the tile map object. Finally, you'll need to export all of your tile maps and tile sets to JSON before you can actually import them into GDevelop. You'll also need to select the Atlas image, which is just the image you used for your tile set. One last thing I'll mention here is collisions. At the time of this video, they're not supported. However, hopefully by the time you're watching this video, they are. At any rate, in the meantime, you can implement collisions yourself by creating your own collision tiles. This is where you create an object the size of a tile that acts as a collision boundary for enemies and characters. This can then be layered on top of your tile map, and you can hide this at runtime either by hiding a layer or hiding them in the actions. So this has been bitmap fonts and tile maps. If you have any questions or feedback, be sure to let us know in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one.
Hey there, I'm Helper Wesley, and in this video, we'll be talking about timers and the new wait action. We'll start by using the example from the platformer video and go into the event sheet. So the biggest difference between the wait action and timers is that one is used as a condition and the other is an action. So for timers, you need an event that is going to start your timer. Otherwise, it doesn't exist. So we can make one with a condition at the beginning of scene, and then we'll add an action and search for a timer. As you can see, there are two kinds of timers that you'll be using. Object timers, which are related to a specific instance of an object, or scene timers, which are more general and don't depend on an object being there to work. But for this one, we're going to start with an object timer. So we're going to use the action start or reset an object timer. And we're going to use the player object. And then you need to give it a name and make sure that it's in quotations. Next, we'll make an event where if the value of the object timer for the player with the name that you gave it is greater than 1 second, then we'll simulate that the jump key is being pressed for the player, and if we press preview now, you'll see that once we get past 1 second, the jump key is being continuously pressed, because the condition is true, and it's beyond 1 second. So, we could add trigger once as a condition, but we could also use the same action as before to reset the timer. So now if you preview the game, every 1 second, the player will jump and the timer will reset, so it'll do it again. But now we're going to do the exact same thing, just using the wait action instead. So we'll use the condition of the player object being on the floor, and then we'll copy and paste down this jump event, and we'll add the action wait X seconds and put in 1. And we'll put that below the wait action so that the wait action triggers first, causing us to wait 1 second and then jump. And this event does need the trigger once because it doesn't have a timer resetting to make its condition false. Those are two different loops to get the character to jump using the timers or the wait action. But now I want to show you how to do something that was requested by the comments. How to make a health bar heal over time. And what we're going to do is copy most of the events from before, but changing the name to healing so it makes more sense. And then we'll search for the action to change the object variable of the player character. But first we need to give them one, so we'll press here, and then press add a variable. We'll call it health, and make it 1. Then we can make the player object's health variable go up by 1 every time the timer loops, just like before. And then using the method shown in the first expressions video, we can make the tiled sprites expand to represent the health that the player has. But we do need to have a maximum. So we'll just go to the events and add a condition where this will only trigger if the player's health variable is below 6. And that's all there is to it. Now to show a couple other examples of how to use the wait action and timers. Beginning with the timers. In this template game, we're using a timer as the fire rate for the gun. And we're using a variable instead of a hard number so that the fire rate can change throughout the game. And we're also using it as a condition for recoil as well, where it's started and resets when the bullet is fired. As for the wait action, we're using it for the countdown timer at the beginning of the game and when you die. You can see there's some actions happening, and then we wait for a second, and then there's some actions happening, and then we wait for a second, and then there's some actions happening, and we wait for a second again, until finally the game starts. And this is what that looks like. So remember, we're using the timers as conditions, and then the wait action as a way to delay sections of an action. But this has been a tutorial on timers and the wait action. As always, be sure to comment down below and tell us what kind of tutorial you would like to see next. I've been Helper Wesley, and I'm glad I could help. Let's talk about multiplayer in GDevelop. GDevelop has a new system in place that makes setting up multiplayer really easy to do. It comes with its own lobby system, where players are authenticated and then joined together in lobbies so they can play together, handling all of the network trouble for you, and then with the help of an easy-to-use behavior and a bunch of new actions and conditions, multiplayer just works. So let's get into a real example. Here I have a little game where you can drag these blocks around and the objective is to try to get the ball into the hole. So I'm going to turn this into a two-player experience. The first thing you need to set up is your lobby. In this case, I just have a separate scene called lobby and a button for lobby. I have it set up so that when the lobby button is clicked, we use the action open the lobbies, which will open up this lobby screen, and then players can choose their lobby. And this second event For when the lobby has started, so once all of the players ready up and the host has started the game, change the scene to the game scene. So we'll go from the lobby to the game scene. And at that point, all of the players will be synced together and connected into a single lobby. So if I click to preview the game and go down to launch preview in, I can select multiple windows to open at one time. So if I open 2 windows, I can open multiple lobbies for myself, and I can join the same one and ready up in both lobbies. Then I can press start. But the issue here is, if you see it, right now there's no connectivity between the 2 games. So let's explain how this works. When a lobby is created, the first person to join the lobby is considered the host. And the host, or the first player, will be the server of the lobby. So when a lobby is created, the other games will have their global variables, scene variables, and the scene you're in synchronized with the first player. But all of the objects in each scene, including their variables, effects, and animations, are all controlled independently. So the 2 screens we just showed were synchronized in a lobby, but it was just the variables and the scene that were being shared. So inside this object, I can add the behavior for multiplayer object, and this will allow an object to be synchronized with other players in the lobby. This again includes the animations, the effects, the position, the variables, and everything else. So when I add this behavior to the object, I'm able to select the owner. So by default, the host is sending information to the other players to synchronize the games. But when you add this behavior to an object, then that player is now the one sending out information about an object and telling the other games what to do with it. So let's set this object to be controlled by the host, and then in the advanced options, I'm able to tell the game what to do if the player who owns the object drops out. And by default, the object just gets deleted. So now this large square is owned by the host. And I'll do the same thing with the other 2 objects as well. So now when I get the game set up, and I move the objects around, you can see them happening in the other game as well. Because player 1 is the owner of this object, so when player 1 changes the object in some way, it affects it on player 2's game. But because player 2 doesn't own the object, you can see when I try to drag it, it snaps back in place. And that's because player 1 owns the object. So player 1 is constantly telling player 2, hey, the square goes here. Now if we want to change that, we can go to the game's events and set it up so that when an object gets dragged, the player dragging that object now becomes the owner. And I have a group for draggable objects. And in that group is the corner object and the large square. So now if it's being dragged, we'll use the action for ownership so we can change who owns the object. And I'll select draggable objects because that's the object group with both objects. So whoever's game it is that's running this event, that will be the player number that's chosen. And trigger once. So now, player 1 can still drag the object around, but if player 2 grabs a hold of it, now player 2 owns the object. So you're passing the ownership back and forth between both players. So now both players can play together. But if I press start, the ball isn't working yet because in this game's events, clicking the start button turns on the physics behavior and turns off the dragging behavior, but player 2 isn't the owner of that object. So player 2 is not allowed to change anything about objects owned by player 1. So we need to change the ownership of the object in the same way that we did before. So when the start button is clicked, we'll change the ownership of all of the physics objects. Because I have a group with all of the physics objects in it, all of the physics objects are set to the player that pressed the start button. And for the reset, since it changes the position of the object and the behaviors, we'll need to do the same thing. So whichever player clicks reset will take ownership of the objects and then perform those actions. So now when you start or reset the game, whichever player did it will take ownership of the objects and make the changes. So the 3 big things that you want to do in a multiplayer game: open and close the lobby, change who owns which object, and how that affects the game, and send custom messages to other players. This action will allow you to send messages to all of the other players in the game that do very specific things. If you want the game to pause for all players at the same time, for example, you can send a message and call it pause, and then put whatever you want into the content, and then as a condition, you can check to see if that message was received, and have that as one of the conditions to doing an action. So you can send a message to the other players, and when they receive it, have them perform some kind of action, like pausing everybody's game. So the multiplayer feature in GDevelop brings a bunch of new actions and conditions along with that behavior that was shown earlier, and now in your game dashboard, there's a multiplayer option there that right now only lets you set up the number of players in your lobby, but this will eventually have more things as multiplayer develops more in GDevelop. The last big thing to talk about is who has access to the multiplayer feature in GDevelop. Multiplayer comes with hosting and bandwidth fees for lobbies, player accounts, and maintaining the infrastructure for thousands of potential players. But in GDevelop, everybody will have access to this feature. So everyone will be able to build and playtest their own multiplayer game. But to cover the cost of hosting these services, you'll need to get a subscription in order to get an unlimited number of lobbies. We'll link to the documentation about multiplayer in this video's description. But if you would like to learn more about GDevelop, then click on this. Here's how resource loading works in GDevelop. The way resource loading works now in GDevelop has changed. When a game starts, resources are now loaded into the game scene by scene, following the order that the scenes are placed in the scene list. So in this example, it starts with the opening scene, the first scene, and then the second scene. And to show how this works, I've set up these 3 different scenes, the first one having very few resources in it, but the next 2 scenes have a lot of resources that need to be loaded in. When you preview the game from the engine, you won't really see the loading happening because the resources are already on your computer. So to really see this in action, you need to export your game to another browser. We can generate a link to gd.games to run a quick test. When the game first loads in, it's going to go pretty quickly because the first scene had no extra resources. But when I go to the second scene, you'll see the loading bar starts up again. So the engine will now load the resources from the first scene during the initial loading, and then in the background will run the rest of the scenes. So while we're here in the first scene, in the background, scene 2 is loading in. So if we wait long enough, and then click to change to scene 2, there won't be a loading screen between the 2 scenes. The reason this new method of resource loading is important is because it means your players can jump right into your game, rather than having to load the entire game up front. And once all of your scenes are loaded in, you can flip between your scenes without any loading screens. So, while this is really great for getting your players into your game really quickly, this does mean that if scenes aren't loaded in, there's a potential for the engine to show you that loading screen between your scenes. But we can create our own custom loading screen if we want something else instead. So in Engine, what we're going to do is create a transition scene. We'll add a new scene and call it transition, and then open that scene. We'll change the background to black, because usually you fade to black between scenes. And we'll grab an icon to use as the load indicator. We'll use this saw, because the saw is playing an animation which will show players that the game is still running and hasn't frozen. Now we'll go to the event sheet, and set up some events, where at the beginning of scene, we will preload a scene. And for now we'll start with the first scene. And then we'll check to see if a scene has been loaded in with another event. And then if that scene has been loaded into the background, we'll change scene to the first scene. Which means now we need to go to the opening scene, and instead of changing it to first scene here, we'll change it to the transition scene. So now when we click the first scene, we'll change to the transition scene, and the transition scene will preload the first scene in the background, and when that scene is loaded, we'll change the scene to first scene. And before we export the game to test it, we'll move the transition scene up to the top. So when the game loads in, it will load opening scene first, and then the transition scene, and then these heavier, more demanding scenes. And now we'll generate a link. So the opening scene loads in, and then when I click on scene 1, we'll go to that transition scene, which will serve as our custom loading screen between these two scenes. And you could do whatever you want here. You could have animations or videos or progress bars or whatever you want to do with this scene, you can add it in. But between scene 1 and scene 2, there will still be this progress bar. So let's change that. We'll use this transition scene for everything in the game. So to do that, we need to first make a global variable, and we'll call it scene transition, and then press apply. So then in the opening scene, right here where the transition scene is picked, we'll change a text global variable, the scene transition, and set it to the exact name of the scene we're going to, which is first scene. And make sure to put it in quotation so it registers as text. So now, when we go to change the scene, we'll also change the global variable to the name of that scene. And then in the transition scene, we'll need to go into the action, change to use an expression. We can type in the first few letters to get the autocomplete to kick in. And there we go. So now it'll preload scene transition, the variable. And then we can do the same thing for the condition and action. Change it to an expression, select scene transition, change to an expression, scene transition. So whatever this variable is set to, before coming into the scene, it will then go to once it's loaded in. So we'll do the same thing for this as well. Then I just need to do the same thing to both of the other scenes. So for the last time, we'll start at the opening scene, and then when I click scene 1, we'll go to the transition scene until it's finished loading the scene that we're trying to go to. And from that scene, if I click to go to the next scene, we do the same thing. We go to the transition scene in between before going to the second scene. A few things to keep in mind with resource loading is that resources now load per scene, but if you have any global objects, the assets in those objects will be loaded at the beginning of the game as well. Now, if you'd like to continue learning more about GDevelop, then be sure to check out this playlist. Let me show you how to troubleshoot almost anything in GDevelop. So to begin with, there's two kinds of problems that you probably want to troubleshoot. An issue where something is happening and you don't want it to anymore, or an issue where you're trying to do something and it's not working. So I have two different scenes set up for this. The first problem here is this platformer character, and I'll show you what's going wrong. So when the game plays, and I go up to a wall, when I turn, I will jump off of the wall. That's not what I want to happen. I don't want my character jumping off a wall accidentally. So I need to break down what the problem is and figure out how to solve it. The things impacting the character is firstly the fact that it's a sprite object, then the behaviors attached to it. In this case, it's the platformer behavior and the smooth camera extension, and these events. And those are the only things impacting this character. So, where I will usually begin is with the events. So to begin with, the camera is probably not impacting this mechanic, but the animations could be. So we'll disable these and test it out. And it's still happening. So then we go down the list. I've given it custom controls so I can control it with the A and D key, and made it so that it jumps every frame. So let's see if changing that will fix it. I need to disable these controls, go back to the player character, and in the behavior turn back on default controls, so I can move it with the arrow keys and spacebar. And now the only thing that's happening is the characters being flipped when the arrow keys are moving. So then the last thing to try is to disable the flipping. And now we'll try again. And nothing's happening. So the issue is with the flipping. So that's the first and most important part about troubleshooting, is trying to figure out what exactly it is that is causing the problem. So now that I've figured that out, I'll turn all of these back on and turn off default controls and try again. So it is definitely the flipping that is causing the problem. And now I do want my character to be able to flip, so what else could that be? Well, when the character flips, it's the points and the collision mask that get flipped as well as the image. So that's the next place to look. Nothing else gets impacted by the flipping, so one of those two things have to be the problem. Now the points are just, all there is the center point and the origin, so there can't be a problem there really. But for the collision mask, I've made a custom collision mask that fits the object, where the collision mask is actually off-center. And because it's off-center, when the character flips, this back end clips into the wall, which makes the platform behavior see that it's inside of a platform, which makes it think it can jump. And so when the character's flipping, we're clipping into the wall, and the character is able to jump again. So to fix that, we need to make sure these are even. So let me quickly fix that. All right, and now I'm going to test it out. Can I flip off the wall again? Oh, no. I need to re-enable these events. And no, I cannot jump off the wall anymore. So the issue was that the collision mask was flipping and clipping into the wall. Now that the collision mask is the same on either side, when it flips, it's not going to do that. Great, so that's one part of troubleshooting. Turning off the events until we find the one that's causing the issue, and figuring out what that issue is tied to. Now, the second one I want to show you is going to be a little more advanced. So I have an event here that is checking to see if the distance from a coin is less than 20 pixels. And if it is, it'll pick that coin, delete it, add it to the scene variables, create particles, and then change the coin text to show that it's happened. But that's not happening. So the first thing I want to do is move these down and disable them, just to see if the actions are working, and the actions are working fine. You can see the scores going up once per frame, particles are being spawned, and all of the coins have been deleted. So then, we'll try each condition. Nope, that's not working. That did work 24 times, so it kept picking all of the ones around that were closest and deleting them. But when we move these together again, it's not working. So either this condition is not right, or there's something wrong with the ordering of these events. So let's go into the debugger and see just how many of these things are being picked. The debugger is a really handy tool. Here we go, let's shrink this down. And now, let's talk about the debugger really quickly. The inspector, I can press refresh, and I can go to the global variables, see all of them, check on the scene that's playing. I can see the scene variables that are happening. Right now, the number for coins picked up is 0. So we have 0 on the screen. Shows me the number of gold coin instances in the game. And then I can go through each one to find out where it is. And then coins is just the text object. And I can even change the position by going in and editing these numbers. So the inspector is a really useful tool for fiddling around with your game live. Let's change this back to 0. And then, let me go to the event sheet, add a new event, look for console, as an action. And then in the message to log section, I'm going to write in picked instances. Here we go, coins. And press OK. Great, so every frame I'm going to check and see how many of the coins are picked. If you don't know what object picking is, you should really watch our object picking video. Basically, you need to pick an object before you can apply actions to it. So if we don't have any actions picked, so if we don't have any coins picked, we can't do anything to them. So now let's go start the debugger. And down here in the console section, we can see what this action is doing. So it's logging the message in the console, and we can find that right here. So the number we're getting is 0 because 0 coins are being picked, which means as much as I'm waving my cursor around to try to select these coins, none of them are being picked in the first place, so we can't actually do anything to them. So we need to fix that. And the issue for this one is the actions are working, this condition's working, this one might be wrong, but we know that the issue is picking. So pick the gold coin nearest to the cursor is not in the right place in the order, because it's doing this and then trying to pick. So there's no coins being picked. So if we move that one above and press update, when I move my cursor next to these coins, they're being picked. And if I go to the debugger again and check the console, on the frame that the coins get destroyed, this might be hard to see, down here, it's going to click over to 1. Oh, no, it's not. Because it's getting picked and then deleted. So that's not going to happen. If we move this into this condition and have it log before it deletes the coin, then if we go to the debugger, then we'll see the 1. So there we go. Now we know the issue was the ordering of the conditions, because we figured out that we're trying to pick a coin, but no coin was ever being picked. So this was the issue. And now something else I want to show you is this last part of the debugger. Make it small. I can start profiling. So if I click on this and then wait for 10 seconds and press stop profiling, it collected information for the past 600 frames, and I can see just how much time is being taken up by the objects and events per frame. So this is a useful tool for finding out when something is lagging in your game or something is being too heavy. You can check your objects pre-events, so the objects themselves, and then you can check how much of a drain each individual component is. And then if we go down, we can do this for layer effects, objects with effects, other extensions, and then the rendering as a whole. Right now we're just seeing those things, but if I go into the event sheet for that scene, and I put things into a group, and I call this controls, if I update this, go to the debugger, restart the profiling, and stop, I didn't get the full 600 frames, but I want to show you how this works. I now have a section for events and controls. That control group that I put here is now in the debugger. So I can see how much of a drain these controls are having on my game, how much time it takes per frame to compute these events. And I can do that for every single section here. Restart the profiler, and I will see there's events, there's my animation group, there's my controls group, and there's my flip group. And since I wasn't flipping the character, and I wasn't using the controls, then neither of those are taking up any time in the actual events, or any significant time in the actual events. Whereas if I restart this and move the character around, and then stop profiling, you'll see these numbers have changed. This now takes up a 0.01 millisecond time frame and has moved up to 25% of the overall drain my events are having on the game. Hopefully seeing this troubleshooting in action will help you with troubleshooting your own games. Let's make a second video about multiplayer in GDevelop. In the last video, we went over some basics, and in this video, we're going to show some different ways to do things. So to begin with, I have this one character that can run around and is fully animated, and we're going to go from this to a multiplayer game. Now to start with, we have a lobby scene set up, which we're not going to go over because we did that in the last video, and it's not very complicated. It's really only 2 events. But in the game scene, this time we only have 1 player object instead of 2 for player 1 and player 2. So we'll start by giving this one the multiplayer object behavior and leave it set to host instead of picking a player. Because I'm going to use this one object for all of the players in the game, instead of having multiple objects for each individual player. In order to do that, we need a way to pick between different instances of the player object. So we'll add a variable to the player object and call it ID and leave it as a number. Then I'll create multiple copies of the character. Let's make 4. And I'll click into the instance variables and set the first player to 1, and then the one I want for the second player to be 2, and then 3 and 4. And now in the game's events, at the beginning of scene, I can attach an event for each instance of an object and set it to player. So with the 4 player instances in the scene, this will repeat 4 times. And then we'll use the action for player object ownership. And we'll select the player, and then set it to the player object's ID variable. So now the instance with 1 as its ID variable will be set to player 1. And then the one with 2 as the ID variable will go to player 2, and so on. And now if I go to the lobby and preview the game, and click to join the lobby, I'll be told to publish the game. So, you can click to share your game, go to gd.games, and generate a link, and then this link is for your newly registered game. And now that it's registered, if I press preview and join lobby, I'll be shown my lobby options. I can join with 1 player, and then open another preview window to join with a second player, and start the game. Now you can see there's 2 players in the game because in the player object for the behavior in multiplayer, we have it set to destroy the object if the player disconnects. So if there's no player in the player 3 or 4 slot, they'll be deleted. And now that one game owns player 1 and the other one owns player 2, we can move them around with the default controls based on which window we're clicking into. But now I want to set up some custom controls for the game, instead of just using the default controls. So I'll go to the player, turn off the default controls, and then in the event sheet, I'll create a new set of events for the controls. I'm going to start with A, D, and W for left, right, and jump, but I'll add mobile controls next. So to get these to move the character, we use the action for simulate pressing the left key for the player for the platformer controls. And then we change those to work with the key we want to press. So W is jump, and D is right. And now to make your controls work specifically for one character, we'll put these controls under the condition, is object owned by current player? So now we'll only pick the player object that's owned by the current player of this game. And next, while I'm still adding controls, I'll add the mobile controls. So here's the game scene, and down here I have 3 sprite objects with the button state's behavior that you can get by just searching for button. So I'll add these into the scene for left, right, and jump. And then I'll make sure to set these to the UI layer, which is a separate layer I have made, and that way those buttons won't move off the screen. And I'll use the OR condition type along with is button pressed for the button state's behavior. And then I'll set that for all 3 button presses. And there we go. And now if I go to the lobby scene and open a couple of previews, I can use A, W, and D to move the character around, or use the mobile control buttons on screen. And they work for both characters. But now the next thing you want to do with this sort of game is allow the camera to move with each character. And so let's expand the play space. And then go to the player object's behaviors and add the behavior for smooth camera. And now if I preview the game like this, where each instance has its own smooth camera behavior, the camera would move for both players and meet somewhere in the middle because the two instances are fighting each other for control of the camera. With the behavior synchronized, there's no way to turn off the behavior for one instance and leave it on for another one unless you desynchronize that behavior. So here at the beginning of the scene, when we give ownership of the different instances of the player object to each player, before we do that, it's owned by the host. So first, we'll deactivate the smooth camera behavior for all of the instances. Then, we'll disable the synchronization of a behavior with this action. And again, we'll choose the smooth camera behavior. So we'll deactivate it for all of the objects, desynchronize that behavior, give ownership of the object to each player, and then use the condition is object owned by current player, and use the action to turn the smooth camera behavior back on. And now, if we preview the game, each character has their own camera. So if there's a behavior on an object with the multiplayer object behavior that you don't want synchronized between players, you can just desync that behavior, and then it can be controlled individually on each game without any changes being sent to the other players. There's one last important thing to talk about, and that's variables. By default, global and scene variables are synchronized by the host. So any changes the host makes to their game will then be sent to the other players. But that's only the setup by default. Because you can actually do two different things with variables. You can use the action for a player to take ownership of a variable that then makes it so that that player is the one sending out the information. Or you can disable variable synchronization for a variable, and then that way each game can have their own unique variables that aren't shared between players. So a really quick example of this is with pausing the game. If in the game scene, I go to scene properties, I can add a variable and call it pause, and set it to be a boolean. And then I can use that variable to change the timescale from 1 to 0, or 0 to 1 to pause the game. So if that variable is true, we set the timescale to 0 so it pauses, and if it's false, we set it back to 1 so it plays at real time again. And I can use the condition for a key pressed, and set it to P for pause. And set it to toggle the pause boolean variable. But the problem with this is that only the host can currently use this behavior. If any other player tried to use this, they'd press P, and then when the variable gets toggled to the different value, the host, who didn't make this change, would overwrite that variable for the player again, because the host is the one that all of the other games are synchronized to. So in order to set this up so other players can use it, we need to take ownership of that variable. So ownership of the variable pause. So now whichever player presses pause, they'll take ownership of the pause variable, and then because they're the owner of the variable, they're the one that will overwrite the variable for all of the other players. So now if we preview the game, you can see the character jumping, and if I press the P key, time is frozen still. I can go to the other player, press P, and unpause the game. Hopefully this tutorial helped you learn a little bit more about the multiplayer feature in GDevelop. This was based off of an example game that will be linked to in the description. But if you'd like to learn more about how to use GDevelop, be sure to click on this. Let's talk about 5 ways to get more people to play your game. If you're struggling to get your first 10,000 players, this video is going to be great for you. Let's start with number 1. The best way to get people to play your game is just to make a really good game. If you make a really good game, people are going to tell their friends, talk about it on social media, and basically do a lot of the marketing for you. But how do you know if you've made a good game? Well, with GDevelop, you can go into your game dashboard and check your game analytics. As long as you've published your game somewhere and you have some amount of players, you'll be able to check the bounce rate, basically how many players join and then leave immediately, and then check to see how long they've been playing for. And a good graph for your game could be different based on the kind of game you have, but generally, if lots of your players are sticking around to the 15-minute mark, you know that you've made a good game. So let's say you've made a good game, but you still want more players. Well, the second way of going about it is also pretty obvious, but it's important to say, because a lot of developers don't do it. And that's to post your game everywhere. The people who buy games from Steam or the Epic Games Store are probably different than the people who would buy from itch or GOG. So if you only post in one store, you're missing out on the bigger audience you could have. For desktop games, especially those that are paid, you can post your game on Steam, the Epic Games Store, GameJolt, itch, Humble, GOG, and a bunch more places. If your game is a free browser game, you can post it on itch, GameJolt, Newgrounds, or GD.Games, GDevelop's game hosting platform. And if you want to get paid, Crazy Games, Cool Math Games, Pokey, Gamehouse, Congregate, and then if you have a mobile game, you're sort of limited to Google Play, Apple App Store, and the Amazon App Store, but you can post your mobile game on sites like itch with limited results. Posting your game to these different platforms takes time, but you'll be exposing it to a much wider audience. And then the third way is really important, and that's to understand the platform you're posting your game on. How do games on that site gain traffic? For the majority of them, it's based on reviews or number of times played, but different platforms will have their own different quirks. Like with Steam, for example, Steam is not going to organically share your game until it has 10 reviews from paying users. You really need to push hard for that first launch to get those first 10 reviews. And then on GameJolt, for example, they have a partner system. So influencers, YouTubers, marketers, whoever, can share your game with a link and get a portion of your sales. And on GameJolt, in order to gain much traction, you really need to post your game into the communities they have there, which is pretty unique because most stores don't have that, but it's a quirk of that platform. On Newgrounds, you really want to get featured in order to gain traction. And on GD Games, the games are sorted by popularity, but you can try to get showcased by filling out a form from this drop-down menu. So knowing the quirks of the platform you're using is obviously important. Knowing what sort of things you need to do as a developer to get that platform to share your game. But then it comes down to the fourth way, which is to make it pretty. Have the best thumbnail you can possibly get. Really attractive promo art can do a lot of heavy lifting. Use GIFs and videos of gameplay. People notice and are more likely to click on things that are in motion. And finally, it's a good idea to crank up the saturation a little bit, as well as the contrast, to make things pop and stand out even more. And now that you've done all of those things, number 5 is about the legwork. Social media. You can start by reaching out to influencers who already have an audience, but then once you've done that, it's time to put the legwork in yourself. I do suggest though that you start with GDevelop. If you're creating the game with GDevelop, consider that your home base. Post in the subreddit, on Discord, or use hashtag GDevelop when you're posting on Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, anywhere. And then, I would suggest Reddit. If your game is free and of good quality, you can check out our free games, our Play My Game, and our web games, if the game is a web build. Then if your game is a paid game, you can try posting on our indie dev, our indie gaming, or look for a subreddit that's built around the themes in your game, whether that's speedrunning or shooting or whatever. Hopefully by knowing these things, you'll be able to find more players for your game. But if you're struggling with way number 1, and the quality of your game just isn't there yet, check out this video about things you should always do in your game. So you want to make money with your video game. Alright, let's talk about 4 ways to do that using GDevelop. Beginning with the tried and true, premium games. Ever since video games left the arcade and came into the home, you've been able to buy premium games, where the game is put up in a storefront and sold for a set price. With GDevelop, whether you're creating a mobile game or one for desktop, you can export your game and upload it to whatever storefront you want, like itch.io, GameJolt, Humble Bundle, or, like the game Swirl Watch, being developed by Sleeper Games, you can upload your game to Steam. Steam does have an upfront fee for creating your store page, and it requires some extra steps because you'll want to include things like Steam achievements, but Steam's large user base makes it worth the effort. And even if you're developing a mobile game, you can still do this. The majority of mobile games have ads and in-app purchases, but you can get a Google developer account for a one-time small fee, and afterwards freely upload your games to the platform to sell as premium games. Or you can put ads in your game, like this game from Frolic Studio. At this point, ads within mobile games is a commonly accepted practice, and a lot of users might even be happy about the ads if they're woven into the game properly. With GDevelop, integrating ads into your mobile game is really straightforward. You just create an AdMob account, add your app to the account, pick what kinds of ads you want, go to your game, and then use the right actions to load and then display your ad. Then you set up your payment information and start making money. There are a few more steps in between, but there's a helpful tutorial on the GDevelop wiki for that. Side note, do not watch or click on your own ads. That is a great way to get yourself in trouble. Instead, with GDevelop, use this action to change your game to test mode in that scene, so you don't get yourself in trouble. Speaking of ads, the third method is uploading your game to a hosting platform that has their own ads. Like this game, Ball Challenge 2, that's being hosted on Crazy Games. This is actually a great deal for the hosting platform and the game developers because it means that one doesn't succeed without the other. These sites give developers of web games a share of the earnings from ads, based on how well their games are performing on the site. There are lots of websites out there that do this, but 2 examples are GameJolt and Crazy Games. And the 4th way we're going to talk about in this video to earn money with your video game is with in-app purchases. Like ads, if these are properly woven into the game, users can be really happy to have the option to spend a little more money on a game they enjoy. And again, in GDevelop, it's not hard to set this up. You install the extension, create the product that you want to sell, register your product in your game using the action register an item, and then decide how you want purchases to work in your game. This is a fairly new extension in GDevelop, but just like everything else, there's a wiki page for that too. There are lots of other ways to earn money with game development, and GDevelop is working towards making it even easier to monetize your game in the future. But these 4 are the most straightforward ways to go about earning money with your game. Now, if you would like to learn some tools that'll make it faster to make games in GDevelop, check out this video for the top 10 extensions in GDevelop.